Hello, everybody. Today I'm going to do a review of the 1957 Stanley Kubrick film called Paths of Glory, starring Kirk Douglas. Paths of Glory is a movie that is based on a novel of the same name, a French novel, I think from 1925, and the that novel is loosely based on real events. So, what happened in reality is it's set during 19, so I think it was like 1915, and in the movie, in the book, it's 1916, but it's 1915, and it's the middle, well, actually, the beginning of the, middle, beginning? Well, lasted 4 years, so kinda, yeah, it is the middle of the First World War, not the Second World War, of the First World War, and the French and British and Allies are stuck in static defensive warfare against the Germans, and the Germans are also stuck in static defensive warfare against the Allies. And so each side would come up with different strategies to try and break this stalemate. But unfortunately, a lot of times these strategies were like, let's just get a bunch of men and charge at some machine guns. And unfortunately, I'm not exaggerating about that. They did that again and again and again and again. And in this particular situation, I think it's called the Calais Affair, but it may be, it's not called the Calais Affair, it's called something else. I'm not going to look it up. You can look it up if you're interested. But what happened was the French were ordered to advance and take some German positions. And as was the custom at the time, the French artillery launched a barrage, and it was supposed to weaken the German lines. So, but they made a mistake in their calculations, and they were actually bombing the front of the French positions. So when the French went to advance, the French soldiers went to advance, there were big craters and canyons everywhere, and they had to like climb over that. So basically, they made like a big hill in the middle of no man's land that they had to climb over. And when they got to the German positions, they weren't softened at all because they weren't actually hit by the bombardment. And so you had basically guys with rifles going against machine gun positions. And these would be like, you think it's just some guy with like a machine gun, but these would be like pillboxes, like actual cement, concrete pillboxes with machine guns. So that's what they were up against. And even if it wasn't as fortified as that, still a machine gun can shoot hundreds of times faster than one guy with a rifle can, obviously. So the French soldiers, they discovered very quickly that they didn't like the situation. It was impossible. So they stopped advancing and they went back to their trenches. And their superiors were saying, advance, 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 advance. And they're like, no, I don't think we're going to. And the general in charge of this advance, he ordered the French artillery to begin bombing the French positions. And he was like, the people in charge of the artillery were like, are you sure those are our positions? And he's like, yes, yes, bomb them. And then the people in charge of the artillery were like, we're not going to do that without a written order. And then the guy forgot. So the guy was like really angry, and so he decided that people of who didn't advance, they should be charged with treason, cowardice, and shot. And the French the French situation wasn't as dramatic as other other situations. I guess the Austrians were probably the country that was executing the most people for cowardice because of the multi-ethnic nature of their country. So, so Czech people wanted their rights, so they would surrender en masse to Russians, and so the Austrians didn't like that very much. But sticking to this situation, what happened was they had this court march. So basically, it was like, we are going to execute some people, find some people that we can make scapegoats of. So they drew lots, and it was a mix of privates and officers who were court-martialed for cowardice. And in the end, the privates were let go because they decided it wouldn't be fair, because they had just been chosen randomly, so it wouldn't be fair to execute them. But the officers were the ones who were actually in charge of the men, so if the men didn't do what they were ordered to do, that was the officer's responsibility. So that's what actually happened. Oh, and then they were executed, those officers were executed. And then their wives were fighting for years after, maybe not years, like a decade after they were executed, to exonerate their names, and eventually they were exonerated officially in France, I think in the 1920s. So, as I said, about 10 years after the end of the First World War. So that's what really happened. And in the movie, that plot is more or less the same, except privates are killed and court-martialed. And I have a lot of thoughts about the movie because generally it's one of those movies where maybe you're not quite paying attention to when you watch it, and then like it finishes, and then you start to think about some of the things um, that they say. There's this really great scene where these two soldiers, who are just some random characters, are talking about, like, this one soldier has this theory that soldiers aren't scared of death, they're just scared of pain, because, he wears a helmet because getting shot in the head would probably hurt more than getting shot in the butt, and nobody protects their butt from being shot because it wouldn't be as painful. And, they have this really interesting conversation about that, because the there's a difference between dying in a war, right, and being executed in a war. Because if you're dying in a war, you always have this, like, yeah, I'll get out of it. And one of the characters actually says that when he's court-martialed, like, yeah, I'll get out of it. Um, but they won't, right? Because they are executed at the end. And that ending was kind of controversial when the movie came out, because it's not a happy ending, but it's based on a true story, right? And this film was like very controversial in France. They said that it was anti-French, but it's literally what happened during that time. So it's just a reflection of facts. Um, yeah, another criticism that the movie got, which I've heard a lot, and that is I guess, the Kevin Costner effect. So if you don't know, in 1991, Kevin Costner starred in a movie called Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and this was the biggest movie, one of the biggest movies of 1991. And people kind of criticized him because he doesn't have a British accent. But, but, uh, Robin Hood is a fictional character. That's the first thing. And second thing, Robin Hood lived 500 years ago. So the English accent back then would have been incomprehensible for people to understand, right? Like, maybe even he spoke French, right? Like, maybe it was longer than 500 years ago, 600 years ago, 700 years ago, something like that. So it doesn't really make sense to criticize people for not having the accent of the country when the film is in English, right? Because if you make a film about Adolf Hitler, a film in English about Adolf Hitler, a lot of people a lot of movies do this, and I think this is so dumb. They actually would give him a German accent. Um, Maybe that makes sense with Hitler because he was Austrian, but it doesn't make any sense to have like a movie in English have characters who are speaking English in the film, but they're not really speaking English. They're speaking German or French or whatever. Worry that they don't have French accents. And that was a criticism of this film, is that, oh, the accents were too, they weren't French enough. It's like they're not speaking French, so they don't have to have French accents. And I think it's great because the characters did have these different accents, right? So France would have people who had different accents at the time, much more so than now because a lot of regional languages have disappeared, but that's a different topic entirely. So I don't really buy that criticism of the movie. I think that that's dumb. It, but what did I think about the movie? I mean, I've been talking for 11 minutes and I haven't told you what I think about the movie. I would say the movie is ultimately a pantomime of trauma. And what do I mean when I say it's a pantomime of trauma? So, as I mentioned in the beginning, people were living in these trenches for months, right? And this is before they had this rotation system set up where people would be like there for like a couple of weeks and then rest, a couple of weeks and then rest. These were people who had been there for months, right? And they look immaculate. The trenches look immaculate. There's no mud out of place. There's no mud on people's faces. There's no like, crazy beards or crazy eyes. Even the person who has shell shock doesn't look that crazy. And I was thinking about this because I think some aspects of Kubrick, so Kubrick famously was a perfectionist. Like he had this idea of like every single shot that he wanted to take. So I think it doesn't make sense to have a perfectionist to make a movie about the First World War because that war was the epitome of imperfection, right? There was dirt everywhere. It was dirty. You know, I think a lot of movies now, like the trend now is to make gritty movies. Like any historical movie is gritty, and it doesn't make sense with a lot of things. Like the medieval ages actually were quite colorful, so it doesn't make sense that everybody would be wearing brown, right? But in the First World War, during this time, people were wearing camouflage. I mean, you can't, it's black and white, but like even in black and white, you can tell that all of the uniforms are perfect. Everyone's clean. There's no dirt beneath the fingernails. So I think that's one of the main problems of the movie. And I think that there's other problems with the movie as well. One of them would be the actually I think that this is a good thing. As I said, officers were executed in the real situation, but in this they're privates, and you can see this chain of like, so basically what happens in the movie is this one general suggests an attack, and he says to another general that he would be promoted if he captures this objective, and then that general goes to like a captain or something and says, oh, make it happen, and that captain goes to like the lowest rank above being a private, and then they have some confrontation. So it's actually a really good character study of the relationship between all of those people and how the decisions at the top can be really tragic for the men at the bottom. But I think one thing, yeah, there's a couple of things that make the movie maybe not a failure, but not as good as it could have been. And I think one is we don't spend any time with the men who are actually executed in the beginning of the movie. So they're just, and I think it's a stylistic choice. Like we don't know anything about them and then they're sentenced to be executed, and then we get some development of their character and we know who they are and they have some personality. So it would be good if we had a little bit more foreshadowing about, like, there's one guy who has like an entire plot before the court martial, but the other two are just kind of thrown in there. So that doesn't really work. I think one thing that people might criticize is the way that they react when they're being led to their execution. I wouldn't criticize that at all because I think people react in very unpredictable ways in situations like that. Some people would be laughing, some people would be crying, some people would be hysterical, some people would be passive. It just depends on whatever day they're having and how they feel about what's about to happen to them. So, yeah, we don't have much time to develop those characters. So I didn't like that. Oh, and I think that my biggest, because in 1957, I think there was this clear division between the bad war, which was World War One, and the good war, which was World War Two. And yes, the motivations of the parties concerned, for the most part, in the First World War, were pretty bad. But how can you criticize France for fighting against a German invasion? You can't really criticize them. You can say, well, they were part of this system that led to it being a much bigger war, but the reason they were part of that system is that they were trying to prevent a German invasion. So I think that's not what's lacking. You don't need like complicated political background to understand this, but I think the motivations of the people at the top when they order the court martial, it's so they just say, oh, it's to provide a good example. But towards the end of the war, in France and in Russia, obviously, so in Russia, the war effort completely collapsed and there was a revolution. And France is famously famous for having revolutions. So that should have been that was the motivation for the French army to be so harsh on its soldiers, is because they didn't want a revolution. And towards the end of the First World War, maybe there wasn't a revolution, but the French army was not cooperating at all. So it wasn't just to set a good example, it was to make sure that when somebody orders you to your death, that you would actually do it. And I don't think that the movie did a good job of explaining the fear in the upper echelons of French society that they had against the lower ranks. They didn't do a good job there. You know, it just seemed like one of these, oh yes, the generals are just having parties and they don't know what's going on in the trenches. And, that's true and everything, but I don't think that that was the main motivation. The main motivation was to stop revolutionary behavior, I believe. All right. So thank you everybody for watching. If you've seen Paths of Glory, what do you think? Put your comments in the comment section where they belong.